um, Thank you. Thanks so much, Smashing, for having me. Thanks to you all for being here. It's a pleasure, and we're gonna dive into, I think, the future of design systems, as the name says on the tin. But I feel like in order to talk about the future of design systems, we kind of have to start at the past of design systems. So let me give you a quick tour of our collective trajectory as an industry over the last 30-ish years. So, websites. Once upon a time, very first website made in 1991. We got sort of CSS around that time. We also had things like GeoCities, right? For all you old school people out there, perhaps. But basically, like back in the early to mid 90s, if you wanted a website, you just kind of jumped into code and wrote some HTML, and you might have like a cool tiled background on your GeoCities page and stuff like that. But that was the extent of web design. Uh, Around the mid 90s, Creating Killer Websites was a popular book that basically sort of got into here's how you could take Photoshop and kind of design websites in Photoshop, and then you could sort of slice up your Photoshop comp and turn that into an HTML website, which is pretty crazy. So that's kind of like how this industry was kind of born. With we kind of have web design, and then we are starting to build these web designs out in the browser. And kind of around the same time, the internet kind of got some legs and some traction, right? So now no longer is like, oh yeah, this isn't just a fad. Here we are going to have our, say, our company website, but then we'll also have our company, say, intranet, right? So now all of a sudden we're kind of designing our company website as well as our intranet website, and we're sort of repeating this process. And here we introduce this kind of idea of, okay, now we have multiple things. We all sort of are part of the same company. And how do we make sure that, our websites look consistent, right? And so we have this idea of like a brand style guide or brand book that kind of goes back to the 1960s and like the kind of pre-digital age, right? That basically says, here's our logo, here's our colors, here's our typeface, and so on and so forth. And this is the thing that loosely we're applying to this brave new world of web design. Things start getting more sophisticated, right? We have things like Web 2.0 in 2004. We have jQuery. So we get this kind of more interactive phase of our internet journey, which means we're creating new stuff, right? Sort of like these net new, say, web apps. This kind of term starts to sort of creep in here. Around this time, there's whatever, Flash and all that good stuff going on. But basically, the process for creating this stuff is the same. 2007, iOS launches, Android's around the same time. And now all of a sudden, we're creating more digital interfaces for these websites or for these native apps in addition to these websites, right? And at least hypothetically, right, these things are all being sort of, fed or informed by the organization sort of brand style guide, right? But notice all of these connections are loose, right? Like these are just kind of references, right? Like nothing's like actually connected. We're just kind of looking over our shoulder and sort of trying to eyeball this stuff effectively, right? Sketch was released in 2010 and started sort of taking over Photoshop's duties for creating web interfaces and stuff. And so you start seeing teams and designers start to adopt this stuff. Around this time, too, 2010, responsive web design becomes kind of a thing. And kind of coinciding with the birth of responsive web design was kind of these concepts around more sort of component driven design, right? So I had a project called This is Responsive, where it's just like, oh, like here's different patterns for responsive behavior, right? So here's how you could take a data table and like 6 different ways to make that responsive, and different navigation patterns and stuff like that. Turns out this responsive design stuff is hard. And so tools like Bootstrap enter the scene that basically say, hey, here's this kind of like, here's some components, right, that developers can kind of copy and paste, and you tack the classes onto your HTML elements, and you'll get something that looks good, uh, and can help you move a little faster, right? So, kind of aside from these actual sort of projects, we also have just this emergence of this idea of kind of like a pattern library. So we have people like Natalie Down, and we have people like Anna Debenham that are sort of sort of extolling the virtues of, here's this like pattern portfolio or this pattern library that you could kind of copy and paste your buttons and your tabs and your form controls and stuff like that. And also around this time, you have things like more sort of modular driven, sort of CSS concepts starting to emerge. Things like BEM, things like OOCSS by Nicole Sullivan, things like SMAX by Jonathan Snook, and so on and so forth. And so these ideas are starting to emerge around like, hey, let's actually kind of create these more sort of modular sort of styles that are attached to a specific component versus like trying to sort of do the whole home page as its own kind of discrete style thing. Okay, things continue to evolve, and we get sort of frameworks like Angular entering the scene, as well as in 2013 we have React entering the scene. Around this time, in actually a couple of weeks before React was launched, I created a thing that Vitaly mentioned called Atomic Design, which is kind of a methodology for thinking about how all of this stuff kind of hangs together. Like, what is the relationship between these components and the products that those components build? And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But the idea, hopefully, to just kind of paint a picture here, is that things are starting to get a little bit more complex in the world of design. We kind of start seeing this emergence of like a UI kit or UI documentation and stuff like that. That's a little bit more digital oriented compared to like the sort of brand style guides of the past. And then we also have just this explosion, right? React catches on like wildfire. And here's where things start getting interesting. So now we have this idea of a kind of the birth of ES modules, and JavaScript is continuing to progress, and which just kind of gives birth to all of these new sort of React projects and Angular projects. But it also opens the door, especially with ES modules, the ability for teams to actually consume components directly, right? So a team could create a React component library and then sort of feed that to all of its different React applications that are starting to proliferate. So here we get our like first like direct line where we're actually consuming a thing. Sort of similarly, right, you could do the same with these other libraries and stuff like that, right? So you might have your React library, that's the kind of source of truth for your pattern library, and then sort of you could create an Angular flavor of it as well. 2016, Figma enters the scene. In 2017, both Figma and Sketch release a feature called libraries that allows teams to be able to sort of create these components and sort of have and feed those components out into other sort of Figma and Sketch files. And this sort of opens the door to, oh, okay, like we can now actually reuse these things rather than just kind of copying and pasting our buttons. And then it's kind of around 2015, 2016-ish that this actual term called design system enters the scene, right? And what we do here is we kind of like reorganize how we're thinking about all of this stuff, right? We are thinking about this as uh, a collection where the Figma and the Sketch library, what's going on in the design world, and also what's going on in the development world are actually kind of like one and the same, right? They're sort of two sides of the same coin. And then we also have just kind of some guiding framing for this whole concept. So kind of like around this time, we have things like material design entering the scene, and other sort of organizations, Lightning Design System are starting to sort of like pop up and sort of say like, here's our design system. So as a concept. And then we also sort of are reframing this idea of like UX documentation and sort of turning this into like a reference website for the design system. So like material.io, for instance, or lightningdesignsystem.com or whatever. Okay. Around this time, we get sort of design tokens entering the scene in 2016 that are sort of can sort of be fed out, these sort of design primitives that we can kind of feed into both our sort of design world as well as our code world, as well as for two native environments, as well as web stuff as well. And then, yeah, from here, it just kind of keeps getting crazier. We just keep creating more and more stuff, right? At organizations like the world over, we're seeing this just absolute proliferation of websites, of web apps, of digital products that are just, there's a lot going on. And things like start getting more complex, right? We have a bunch of different frameworks and stuff like that. And so what we're seeing on the web side of things, the web development side of things, is that we could actually the technology, this thing called web components, emerges. That's actually been in progress for close to a decade. But they mature enough where we can actually have a web component library that can then sort of go out and power our WordPress and Drupal sites, in addition to our React apps, in addition to our Angular apps and our Vue apps, and so on and so forth. Right. So now we no longer have to create a React flavor, an Angular flavor, a Vue flavor, a Drupal flavor of the exact same components. We can now have sort of more of a single source of truth for the code side of things, which is great. On the design end, Figma just absolutely dominates and kind of pushes sort of Sketch out of the picture. That's not it's not entirely dead or whatever, but pretty much everyone has started making the move to Figma, which again sort of simplifies things, especially within an organization. And then we get sort of tools, other tools out there that sort of make the reference website part of this stuff a little bit more connected, a little bit more, rather than just sort of pictures of JPEGs of UI components. We have more connected tools, Storybook, Zero Height, and so on and so forth, that help make the documentation part of things a bit more live. And then just this world kind of continues to evolve, and we have this like sort of pretty robust ecosystem now, especially at like larger organizations where you might have like a child design system, or like this idea of kind of like recipes. So you might have like marketing website recipe components, and you might have like user analytics dashboard recipes and stuff that are all built from the same design system, but they are sort of their own product specific, like child design systems is how some people talk about them. Anyways, whew. So that's our journey. That's been our journey. And this is kind of like generally where we're at in the year 2024, is we have like an organization that has a design system that's made of these sort of component parts, right? The design library, the code library, the reference website, the documentation. And then we have a bunch of digital products that design system serves. And the idea is that the design system done right, the design system informs and influences the types of digital products that can be made using the design system's ingredients. And what gets made informs and influences what goes in the design system. And this is what in our work at Big Medium, we see teams get wrong, right? Is this balance, right? So sometimes the design system is too far away from the products they serve, and it just kind of serves as this kind of off to the side design experiment or thought experiment. Or it might take the form of an overpowering or overbearing design system that totally steamrolls what goes on in the product world. This is where the like pattern police come after you and stuff like that. Very authoritarian, not very good. And then there's also just like the fast moving product landscape just totally eats the design system and erodes the integrity of the design system, just because the product is moving fast and dumping hundreds of different components into the design system to the point where it's useless. So all to say, this balancing act is where things are really tricky to get this balance right. And this is where all these years later, atomic design as a concept is still, I think, really potent and powerful, right? Because what atomic design does is really helps draw a straight line through. Here's how all of these atomic components get sort of stitched together and composed together to create real honest to goodness product screens, right, with different states sort of flowed through those UI components, right? So here is the relationship between the design system and the products that the design system serves. But anyways, so here's where we're at. So that's the history lesson. Here's where we're at. And in our work at Big Medium, we work with organizations of all different shapes and sizes. We help them establish and evolve their design system efforts. And when we duck our heads into all of these different organizations, we tend to see the same thing again and again and again and again and again, right? And I'm sure that all of you sort of on this call here, if we were to go in and sort of take a look at your design system, I bet you we will find tabs. We will find form controls. We will find text stuff. We will find some design tokens. We will find some buttons. We will find, just the common fare components that we see the world over. And there's this kind of irony that emerges with this, right? The whole point of design systems is like, let's stop reinventing the wheel. Let's create a single source of truth for our digital organization, right? Let's prevent teams from on each digital product from having to recreate their own tabs. Let's instead, create a design system and deliver those tabs to our users, and that would be great. But when we sort of zoom out to the world, we see all of these different, design system teams the world over reinventing the same damn thing again and again and again and again and again. So, my proposition here, what I'm here to talk about is, wouldn't it be great if there was actually a more of a global design system that was able to provide that sort of common fare componentry, right? Things like tabs and accordions and form controls and stuff like that, so that each of us don't have to spend our days and time and effort and energy on our using our finite time on Earth reinventing this stuff again and again and again and again and again. So that's what I'm going to get into here. And that's what I hope is part of the future of design systems, right? So there's a lot of great initiatives out there that are sort of touching on this, and the one that's, I think, most sort of close to the bullseye here is an organization called Open UI, and they've been hard at work for years. And they've actually sort of audited a bunch of different popular design systems and have actually sort of like spelled out like, yes, here is the common components that are sort of sort of captured in a lot of these popular design systems. And so that might be helpful to create, to sort of inform a global design system that could end up sort of powering our own design systems or organization-wide design systems under the hood. So we're going to get into like what this might look like, but the basic gist of it is something like this. Please don't take this too literally. This is just like, these are just kind of, for example, kind of proof of concept kind of things, whatever. But the idea is like, okay, we have this thing called an alert, and nearly all of our design systems have something called an alert. Bootstrap has an alert, Material Design has an alert, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And guess what? That alert has a couple different variants attached to them, right? There's a success version, there's an error version, there's a warning version, and so on and so forth. You could put stuff into that alert. It sometimes has an icon, right? And sometimes it doesn't, or whatever. So the idea is like, you can kind of create a single container called an alert that sort of encapsulates this concept of what an alert is, that sort of provides a lot of the really sort of common fare instances of what that alert is. not comprehensive. I'll get to that in a little bit. But the idea is just like, here's like a pragmatic thing that's just like, ah, yeah, we have a button group and we have buttons and we have different versions of that button, right? We have date pickers, right? Just like when I think of all of the thousands, if not millions of hours that people are exerting, uh, rebuilding a date picker logic like again and again and again and again, it breaks my heart. So wouldn't it be great if we actually had a date picker field? And we'll get into like maybe the differences between like an input that is part of the HTML spec and what this might be in just a little bit. But I think like if for anything else, I hope the most common things that I think are like most powerful for this idea are just like form fields. My God, when you look at like how atrocious so many forms are and how inaccessible they are and how much can go wrong just in like the basic kind of creating a relationship between the label and the input itself, wouldn't it be so great if we just had a text field component that took care of that association between the label and the input? Just even if it did that, that would be just a huge win for the web. These things would need to be like not styled at all, right? Think like browser defaults, whatever, right? So the idea is not to sort of enforce a specific aesthetic. I'll talk more about this in a second, but the idea is thanks to all of this like hard work that the whole sort of design token world has been up to for a long time now, we now have these ideas of like, oh yeah, we can kind of separate the structure and the behavior of a component with its aesthetic, right? So we could sort of define a theme and flow that theme through the same component in order to produce really wildly different results across the board, right? So that's the spirit here, right? So the basic gist is like, let's have a global design system that basically, you know, if this were to become available to us, like what does that actually mean for people like us who are spending our days sort of producing, evolving, and maintaining a design system? I think like the big things that we are sort of focused on, and why I'm so bullish on this idea is that the word comes the word that comes to mind is respect, right? Reinventing a date picker's logic is not a respectful use of a talented human being's time on earth. And that's exactly what all of these organizations are doing, right? Is we're sort of setting designers and developers uh, loose to effectively reinvent something that generally assumes like the same shape, right? You could select between years, you could go between months, you select the date, you might be able to select a range. And like vast amounts of humans' time and life energy is going into producing these things that effectively come out the other end looking nearly identical to the next organization to the next organization. So if we were to have a global design system that kind of like took care of that, at least the basic sort of semantics, functionality, et cetera, that frees up design system teams to focus on the stuff that is actually unique to the organization, right? Because selecting a date isn't unique to a pet salon or an airline or a car rental place or whatever. Like picking a date is picking a date, right? So, but what is the sort of organization specific considerations, components, challenges, and opportunities, right? Like that's what we should be spending our time on, that versus like sort of reinventing what a freaking badge is, right? If the global design system existed, we would be able to have, spend more time sort of focusing on kind of composing these lower level, more atomic components together into what we tend to call recipes, right? So it's like, here's a card. The global design systems card would literally just like be a box with some slots in it, probably. And then organizations and design system teams would be able to say, cool, here's a card, but here's like a product card, right? For this e-commerce experience, right? Here's the customer card, for instance, for the analytics dashboard or whatever. And so teams can focus more on that sort of composition versus the invention of and reinvention of base level components, right? Still need to style it, right? Like theming the global design system as well as any sort of organization sort of specific stuff. Like you still need to do all of that hard work, and that ain't an easy task, right? So the spirit is, it's like the global design system is not inflicting a specific aesthetic on you. It's just like, here's the raw materials that at least gives you like the sort of semantic markup, the good accessibility stuff, as well as sort of an API to sort of plug into. And then, of course, like it's no surprise that design system work is really human focus, right? Like the success or failures, like in our work with like dozens and dozens of enterprises, it's like the work is not around how well architected your button or your alert is. The success or failure of your design system has everything to do with the human processes that go around a design system. So, how is this being used, right? Do consuming teams have what they need in order to be successful, right? Do they need more training? Like, can you spend more time with them? And again, right now, design system teams aren't able to do that because they're too busy reinventing the wheel for the umpteenth time, right? So, by having a global design system, like we'd be able to focus a lot more on making sure that all the people using the design system are more successful. And then, of course, this stuff needs to be maintained, right? Any sort of, custom components, as well as sort of updating, if there are sort of new versions of the global design system, for instance, sort of, doing all of that important work. So that's kind of what it means for the people who create this stuff, right? People like us. And then there's people who use the web, right? So I think like the big picture, like the big outcome of all of this is like, what we want to see is just a way higher level of quality of the world's web experiences, I think. You know, things that have fewer accessibility errors, things that use better semantics, right? Things that are just sturdier, right? So, coming back to this idea of like a text field, right? Just a basic, here's a label, first name, last name, and the input fields that go with them. When you look at the world's accessibility errors, like so many of them are due to just that label is not associated with that input, for instance. So wouldn't it be great if we just like, if that was a solved problem, right? And when you sort of multiply that by the billions of different form controls that exist on the internet, like that would be a huge win for the web. But also, users would get a more consistent and cohesive and predictable experience, right? And that's what we like to extol when we're talking about an organization-wide design system. It's like, here's what our users get. When you go from this page to this page to this page to this flow to this flow to this flow, the date picker is going to behave the same. That reduces friction. That gets them on with their day faster and helps the business or organization accomplish their goals better, right? So by sort of having more consistent and cohesive behavior for things like, where's the freaking close button on the modal or whatever, or can I click outside of the modal to close this thing, right? If we had a global design system that kind of baked in a lot of that default behavior, that'd be really helpful. And then also, it's worth stating that this stuff is like connected, right? So it's like, as the design system grows and improves and whatever, we could actually sort of bump a version, update things, and then users of those web experiences would sort of get that stuff for free, right? So again, that sort of higher quality, more accessible experiences can be ongoing. It's not just like kind of a one and done thing. So earlier this year, at the beginning of this year, I published an article about this, and I've actually been talking about it at a few conferences kind of leading up to this article. But it's been great. It's been really great. So this isn't my first time kind of talking about it, but it's still kind of early days. So let me just like share kind of where we're at with this thing and to sort of like reflect back sort of some of this stuff. And I'm excited to talk with you all about sort of the pros and cons and sort of enthusiasms and skepticisms about it. So I was recently on The Question, which is hosted by Ben Callahan. He asked a question about design systems, and he posed to his audience, he said, should there be a global design system? And what was fun is you saw a nice 80% yes versus 20% no. And the people who were sort of saying like, yes, were like, hell yeah, this makes a ton of sense. A lot of people have reached out to me saying like, I've been saying this for years. Like other people, yes. And other people sharing their stories, I think, really sort of underscore the need for this, right? So I recently started my new design system job, and I'm disheartened to effectively be rebuilding the same thing I did at my last company, right? At my agency, I literally have 3 developers implementing according components in 3 separate but essentially the same projects, right? People are like struggle to find the most accessible components to use, right? People don't want to have to deal with the details and gory details of markup and ARIA attributes and stuff as much as they'd like to. And then tons of people basically saying, "Oh yeah, like we already have this," and I'm happy to sort of share that with you. So I'll sort of I'll pause there, but on the sort of pros of that. So a lot of people are enthusiastic about it, but there's also been some really great sort of skepticism and feedback. And a lot of the skepticism I share myself. Like I'm not that naive. I'm not I'm not yeah, I'm not so naive to know that this stuff like is difficult and whatever. But let's get into it because I think that there's some good stuff. I talked with Chris Coyier and Dave Rupert on the Shop Talk show about a global design system. And Chris wrote some really great thoughts that were just like some really great sort of things that were on his mind about the concept of it, the feasibility of it, and sort of what some of the challenges would be around it. And I think that they're all like really well considered. And I have kind of like a rebound post forthcoming. But some of the things that I've heard from people is like, isn't this just HTML? Right. So if we like talk about this, it's like, well, that's what HTML is, right? Like we have HTML and then our design systems use HTML in order to sort of make this stuff happen. I don't think that these are the same things. I like to equate HTML elements with more of like the low level dowel rods and screws of IKEA furniture, right? And this is what we've had to work with to date, right? It's basically like dumping all of like the sort of low level ingredients out on the table. And then it's like, here, build some furniture with this. And turns out, we get a lot wrong with that, right? So this is an annual depressing report that comes out every year. This is called the WebAIM Million. They go out and they audit, do an accessibility audit of the top 1 million homepages across the web. And there's just like, at least 50 accessibility errors per page on average, which is, not great. And it's basically like, 96 or 97% of these web pages like have serious accessibility issues. So we're not doing well. And year over year, it's like the same general number, right? So what we need, and I think a lot of this is due to the fact that all teams have to work with is these like sort of like low level dowel rods and screws, and it'd be like, here, you figure it out. So what I think we need different than that is we need more prefab components, right? We need more composed, we need more sort of like assembled pieces that we are able to sort of use in our projects. So that's the difference. So it all of course uses HTML, but I see this as a layer that sort of sits on top of HTML that sort of takes these low level HTML elements and composes them together. This is a fun one. We already have a global design system. And whenever people say we already have a global design system, they are often like, it's Bootstrap or it's Material or it's whatever. These things absolutely are possible or are sort of accomplishable what we're talking about here, but they're not doing it. Even if they are more general purpose, they are not doing it uh, at the at the it's not in like the place where it ought to be. But also nearly all of these really popular design systems ship with a default aesthetic, right? Material design has its like little ripple effect on its buttons, and Bootstrap kind of has its own buttons and stuff like that, right? Button styles, and we see teams hack the crap out of Bootstrap in order to bend it to its custom uh, to their needs, right? So technically, yes, all of these things, all of the ingredients kind of already exist, but it's just kind of like not happening at the right place or the right level, right? So same thing with this. This is like another sort of thing that has flown by my eyeballs a bunch of different times. And it's like sort of similar thing where it's just like, oh yeah, like you're just like creating a new bootstrap or a new material. And I think that what we're talking about is again, it's like a deeper level than existing design systems, but a layer on top of HTML. So we're kind of like going somewhere new with this, right? So it's less about like the what, right? Because we know what the what is the world over, right? Badges, accordions, form controls, all the things I've been sort of already talking about. It's more about sort of like placing it in a place and having ownership of it in a place that makes sense, right? So things like the W3C and Open UI, which is like kind of like an extension of and sort of like in cahoots with the browser makers and the W3C and the standards bodies and ARIA, and WCAG and all of that stuff. The idea is it's like, here is the like officially sanctioned tabs. Here is like the W3C and ARIA and WCAG officially sanctioned, accordion and so on and so forth, right? So it's more the sort of formalization of it and the placement of it and the ownership and stewardship of it than it is about like all of these buttons don't work and we need to reinvent a new a button or whatever. This is more an act of curation and sort of like pulling it into the right sort of formal entity. This is another interesting thing and why this is different than HTML. With HTML, they understandably need to be comprehensive in their use cases, right? So it's like crazy stuff with like respect to accordions, for instance. They've been like trying to get that into HTML proper for years. And there's these like weird, just outlier cases where they're like, well, technically that's an accordion, right? And yeah, sure it is. And like you could get very sort of like existential with it. But at a spec level, at like an HTML level, you'd need to handle every use case because it's part of HTML. That's why I think that sort of having it as a layer on top of HTML gives us kind of this opportunity and license to really shoot for a pragmatic kind of 80-20 role, right? Like, yes, there's all sorts of crazy stuff you can do with UI components, and you can have crazy form controls that do a bunch of backflips, or you could have a starburst button that's rendered as a SVG that sort of does all these different transforms when you click on it. But by and large, when we look at these use cases that are captured in the world's design systems, what you're often like looking at is just here's your standard form controls. Here's a radio group. Here's a checkbox group. Here's a text field. Here's a text area field. Here's a select field. Like so on and so forth. It has some basic validation. It has some basic stuff. It's the common pragmatic, just kind of here's the majority of use cases for this thing, and that's all it can be. And if you need something custom, right? Well, guess what? You still have access to all of the low level dowel rods and screws and HTML elements that we've been building things from scratch for years doing. So it's like that option still exists. This is more of an opt in, pragmatic head start for a lot of these components. Things will look the same. I've been talking about this for years because a lot of people are just like, why don't we all just standardize on Bootstrap or Material Design or whatever? And I liken it to like sort of sci-fi, futuristic sci-fi things where it's just like eventually we just like solve fashion in the future. Everyone's just kind of wearing the same uniform and so on and so forth. But of course, reality is so much different than that. But if we strip away all the aesthetic and the brand, we basically have like for a button, we have a button that could be a link, we have a button that could be an action, we have a button with an icon after it, we have a button with an icon before it, we have an icon only button, we have different sort of visual aesthetics and this idea of kind of like whatever primary or secondary or so something like that. Big buttons, small buttons, block level buttons, buttons that look like hyperlinks. So it's like all of these things sort of take a predictable shape. And what you can do is create a themable design system. And we do this all the time with many different clients that give us the opportunity to sort of share the same structure and bones and props and things like that and be able to sort of flow wildly different aesthetics for them, right? So we've done this with Condé Nast to big publishers, with like a bunch of different brands, as well as Dot Meredith. We've done this with like Marriott. We've done this with Pfizer. We've done this with like all sorts of different brands that are supporting multiple different brands, supporting multiple different use cases, supporting marketing products, as well as sort of more, web app or SaaS products and stuff as well. And you get this idea of, it's like, here's the same bones, the exact same markup, the exact same structure. We're just flowing different aesthetics through the same markup, right? So we get the HTML, we get the semantics, we get the accessibility stuff, but we don't have to reinvent the card again and again. Web components have problems. Yep. I'll leave that there for now. That's a whole other talk. And then also, this would be hard to do. Yes. But this is kind of what we're after, right? It's like we tend to define a design system as the story of how your organization designs and builds digital interfaces. And what we're trying to do is create an official story for the world, right? Here is the world's tabs and the world's badges and the world's accordions. And this is a hard task. But at the same time, I think that it's a noble task, because right now we are just burning a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of like human potential on sort of reinventing this stuff. So where are we at? This is the real broad strokes of how I see this going down. Right now, what we're doing is really kind of connecting with the right organizations, places like the W3C, OpenUI, and so on and so forth. From there, like we'll like hopefully get to a point where we can formalize this thing, then do the discovery work of like sort of auditing what's going on in other systems and soliciting input and all that stuff. OpenUI has already done a lot of this work, which is awesome. And then from there, it's like, okay, then it's a matter of like actually creating the thing. And then, of course, the idea would be to sort of like govern it and figure out like what goes in the global design system versus not. And that's all really hard work, as we all know, as design system maintainers and governors, right? So, but yeah, so this is where we're at. But I think at the end of the day, in sum, we have so much potential as human beings. And in my work, working with a lot of organizations, I see a lot of human potential left on the table because we're like head down reinventing the badge component again and again and again and again. And what I want to see in the future of design systems and the future of the world really is really like a more respectful use of our finite time here on this earth, right? Like, should we be spending our time on earth rebuilding the date picker component? Like, probably not, right? Like we're capable of a lot more than we give ourselves credit for. And so that's kind of, I think, the spirit behind all of this. How can we, respect people more, respect their time more, respect their potential more, right? Help them realize that potential rather than signing themselves up for drudgery simply because we have no other choice to do so. So anyways, I am curious to hear all of your thoughts, skepticism, feedback, and stuff like that. We're really here to kind of keep the conversation going. And with that, thank you all very much for your time. If you want and need help with your organization's design system, you could feel free to reach out. We'd be happy to help. Okay, thank you.
Brad. Now you stirred quite a discussion in the chat. Oh, well, now look at you. It's interesting because, well, first of all, thank you so much for the wonderful talk. It's always very inspiring, kind of important to think about those things. I'm wondering at this point, there was in the very beginning, just before you started even, or even just as you started, there was a question that came up very, very quickly. And I think it all kind of ties in with what I want to ask you. And the question is, so we've built a design system and it's in a pretty good shape, but then it seems like there is no interest to use it by teams. People feel like it just slows everyone down. How do I ensure designers finally follow design guidelines? Do you see a little bit of frustration there?
Yeah.
And then in brackets, PM here. And I think like, imagine like kind of creating sort of a segue, right? I think like in many ways when everybody feels like they're a little bit snowflake, a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, given that, let's say, imagine that we actually established a global design system in place, don't you feel that people would still feel like, we are different?
Yeah.
We need to 100%. Create our own kind of thing that's not for us, right?
Yep. Or, and that will continue to happen, right? Like, I think that's what we see with design systems in the situation that the person asking the question, what they ask, like we see time and time and time again. Organizations have design systems. Here they are. They think they have like pretty good solutions in place and nobody's picking it up, right? And again, that coming back to what I was saying in the talk, is more a matter of the human side of things than it is about like whether or not that button is well constructed or looks good, or is it in React or Vue, or does it have this prop name or this prop name? Like all of that stuff tends to be incidental, right? So the work involves saying, not going like, oh, we're over here building this, why isn't anybody using it? The work is to actually like lean in and connect with those people as human beings to better understand, hey, product team, what are you up to? What are you struggling with? We are here to make your life easier, right? So design systems are really a service organization. They're a means to an end. And it's really important for the design system to be able to actually connect with and help enhance and accelerate real product work. If it's not doing those things, it's dead in the water, right? So that is important to, it requires leaning in to and better understanding your users. And in this case, your users are design development product teams who are building websites, apps, native apps, whatever. And you need to be like, how can we make your lives easier? Right.
Yeah.
And kind of the way that we do that in practice, and I know that we probably have other things to do, is like to actually sort of trial this and put it through its paces. We call them pilot projects, where we're like, you're redesigning the homepage and rebuilding the homepage. Great. We are going to latch on to that. We'll make sure that the homepage is powered by the design systems components. And then we have like a great success story on our hands, where we have the design system components that can do that, and we have the finished product coming out the other end of the line.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Maybe just one more question before we move on. And of course, I want to remind everyone that we're actually going to have a short, small panel after all three talks. So if you have any questions, don't worry, they will be asked. And Brad, please confirm, they will be answered. Is that right?
Sure. Happy to chat about that. Obviously,
there's no way out now on that, right? But maybe one thing before we go, I'm just thinking. I think the key for us to kind of getting to the point where we realize, okay, we have a global thing now, is that it must be so simple to use it. It must be so difficult not to use it. That's kind of the goal. Meaning, like, you have basically all the simple things and components and prepared beautifully. Like, you have a nice Figma starter pack, if you like. You just launch it, and then all you have your wonderful matrix of buttons and whatnot. And if you want to change that, okay, here you have your wonderful tokens and variables, and you just adjust it here and there. Oh, you want to maybe import your brand colors and your color palette and your typography and stuff like that. Let's cascade it down. So that would be really nice. I'm just wondering at this point, maybe just again before we go, what do you think? Do you feel like we are at the point with design systems now where we kind of got the gist of how to create one? I think a lot of people are still struggling with maintaining things and with the cultural side of it, the people, like, this is probably the most difficult part of it all, right? But we're pretty good at designing design systems, right? I don't think that we need more master classes around how to design a perfect, I don't know, folder structure for a design system or something like that.
Yeah.
Maybe we do. Where do you think we are?
The devil,
like, if you think about like
the details.
Yeah. So when you think about like the design maturity levels that we have, do you feel like when a team of a particular size is working on a design system, do you like what you see from the big organizations that you're dealing with? What state is it in? Do you feel like, oh, that's really got better over the years? Or do you feel like, oh, still the same problems over and over and over again?
Yeah, and it's all manner of things, right? Everybody's at a different sort of phase of their design system journey, and I think that like what we tend to see is there's this like pretty big stretch of time to just even get to this sort of core set of components that feels generally stable. Sometimes you could get there in 6 to 9 months. Sometimes it's like a multi-year effort to get to that, and it really kind of depends on a lot of different factors. But it's like, just even getting to that point where you could then sort of focus more on, okay, what's next after we have our badge. That's I think the thing. And of course, there's always rebrands and replatforms, and we shift the tech stack, and we like this thing happens and this thing, and so it like knocks a lot of teams sideways, right? So that's why, again, it's like I would love for there to just be, it's like, here's this stuff that is just stalwart, settled solutions that are pretty universal, so that the teams can then focus more on the stuff like, oh yeah, we're changing our tech stack, or we're rebranding, or we're doing all of that. That's more like gnarly, important, and bespoke work to the organization rather than we need tabs.
Okay. Well, that's a fair point. Well, I'm sure we'll hear more from you, Brett, in just a moment. But thank you so much for the wonderful presentation, for the inspiration, and for all the work that you're doing behind the scenes and also on the stage. So thank you so much for all your work, Brett. I'll see you in a bit.
Thanks.